Margaret Ashbury had learned early that survival required more than virtue, it required strategy. Standing in the drawing room of the Caldwell estate in Ravenport, she felt the weight of every eye in the room. The mahogany panels gleamed under gaslight, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears, and at the center of it all stood Henry Caldwell, the Oil King himself, holding a velvet box as if it were a business ledger. He didn't kneel. He didn't smile. He simply opened the box. Inside sat a ring, a flawless emerald surrounded by diamonds, cold and perfect, like everything else in his world. "Miss Ashbury," he said, his voice steady and businesslike, "I believe this arrangement will serve both our interests." Arrangement, not proposal, not courtship, arrangement. Margaret's father had died 6 months earlier, leaving behind debts that would swallow their home, their name, and any future she might have imagined. Her mother had taken to her bed, half mad with grief and shame, and Margaret, 23, educated and utterly unmarketable in a town where bloodlines mattered more than character, had become a problem no one wanted to solve, until Henry Caldwell decided she could be useful. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls themselves were closing in to witness her surrender. Margaret could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second marking the passage of her old life into something new and uncertain. Outside, through the tall windows, she could see the manicured gardens of the Caldwell estate stretching into darkness, perfect and untouchable. Henry Caldwell stood before her with the patience of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath an expertly tailored suit. His dark hair was combed back with precision, not a strand out of place. Everything about him spoke of control, from the way he held himself to the measured tone of his voice, but it was his eyes that unsettled her most. Dark, intelligent, and completely unreadable, like looking into a well with no bottom. "I understand this may seem unconventional," Henry continued, his tone the same one might use to discuss a shipping contract. "But I assure you, the terms are fair. You'll have your own quarters in the house. Your mother will be cared for. All debts associated with your father's estate will be cleared." Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to ask him why. Why her, of all the eligible women in Ravenport? Women with better connections, prettier faces, families that could actually benefit his empire. But she already knew the answer, because she was desperate, because she had no leverage, because she would be grateful. And gratitude in Henry Caldwell's world meant compliance. "What exactly do you require of me?" Margaret asked, her voice quieter than she'd intended. "Discretion, decorum. You'll accompany me to social functions, dinners, charity events. You'll represent the Caldwell name with dignity." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "In return, you'll have security, a position in society. After 1 year, should you wish to dissolve the arrangement, you'll receive a settlement substantial enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. 1 year, 12 months of playing the role of Mrs. Henry Caldwell, and then freedom." It was a business transaction, plain and simple, no different from the oil contracts he negotiated daily, the railroad deals he brokered over bourbon and cigars, except the commodity being traded was her. Margaret looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, pale, gaunt, aged 10 years, in the 6 months since her father's death. The creditors had already come twice, their letters piling up on the entry table like accusations. She had no choice. She had never had a choice. "I understand the terms," Margaret said quietly, lifting her gaze to meet his. 1 year, a public marriage. No interference in your business affairs. "Correct. And after the year? You'll receive a settlement. Enough to live comfortably, independently." The word independently hung in the air between them like a promise, or perhaps a lie. It was more than fair, more than she'd ever hoped for. And yet, standing there beneath the weight of his indifference, Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, something that might have been hope, or dignity, or the last remnant of the girl she used to be. "Then I accept," she whispered. Henry nodded once, as if she'd signed a contract rather than agreed to share his name. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them with measured steps. Margaret held her breath as he took her left hand. His touch was warm, surprisingly gentle, and slipped the ring onto her finger without ceremony. It was heavy, cold. The emerald caught the gaslight and threw green shadows across her palm. "The engagement will be announced tomorrow in the Ravenport Gazette," Henry said, releasing her hand and stepping back to a respectful distance. "The wedding will take place in 3 weeks. My assistant, Mr. Thornton, will handle all arrangements. You need only appear and fulfill your role. Margaret stared down at the ring, watching the light dance across the emerald's faceted surface. It was beautiful, expensive, everything a woman was supposed to want, and it felt like a shackle. "Is there anything you'd like to ask me?" Henry's voice cut through her thoughts. Margaret looked up at him, this stranger who would soon be her husband. 1,000 questions crowded her mind. Did he have family? What had made him this way, so cold, so controlled? Did he ever feel lonely in this enormous house, surrounded by servants and silence? But she asked none of them. "No," she said simply. "I believe we understand each other perfectly, Mr. Caldwell." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. But it was gone before she could name it. "Very well. My driver will collect you and your mother on Saturday. You'll move into the house before the wedding. It will be easier that way." Easier for whom? Margaret wondered, but didn't ask. Henry gave a slight bow, formal and distant, then turned toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the polished wood. "Miss Ashbury." "Yes? I'm not a cruel man. I want you to know that. This arrangement may not be what either of us imagined, but I will treat you with respect. You have my word." Before Margaret could respond, he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway until they faded into silence. She stood alone in the drawing room, the ring heavy on her finger, and tried to remember what it felt like to have choices. That night, alone in her modest bedroom at her family's townhouse, Margaret stood at the window overlooking the city. Ravenport sprawled below her like a living thing, smokestacks rising from refineries, trains cutting through the darkness like iron serpents, the distant glow of the Caldwell oil headquarters burning late into the night. Even now, at this hour, Henry Caldwell's empire never slept. And soon she would be part of it. The ring caught the moonlight, sending green fire across the windowpane. Margaret twisted it slowly on her finger, feeling its unfamiliar weight. It didn't fit quite right, a little too loose, as if it had been meant for someone else. She thought about Henry Caldwell's final words. "I'm not a cruel man." Perhaps not. But he was a man who saw people as assets, relationships as contracts, marriage as a strategic move on an invisible chessboard, and she had just agreed to be his queen. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle screamed into the night, long and mournful. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, she would stand beside Henry Caldwell and speak vows that meant nothing. She would become Mrs. Caldwell, mistress of Sycamore Hill, wife to the most powerful man in Ravenport. And she would do it all with a smile, because survival required more than virtue. It required strategy. The clock on her nightstand chimed midnight, each bell a countdown to a future she couldn't quite imagine. Margaret opened her eyes and looked out at the glowing city one last time. "Forgive me, Papa," she whispered to the ghost of her father, "but I'm going to survive this, whatever it takes." The emerald ring gleamed in the darkness, cold and perfect and absolutely final, and in 3 weeks, everything would change. The Caldwell mansion was a monument to ambition. It sat atop Sycamore Hill like a crown, overlooking Ravenport with the same quiet dominance Henry wielded over his empire. Marble floors stretched endlessly through grand hallways. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, painted with scenes of Greek mythology, gods and mortals locked in eternal struggle, rooms so vast that footsteps echoed like confessions in an empty cathedral. Margaret had been living there for 2 weeks, and she still felt like a trespasser. The wedding had been efficient. No flowers, no music, no sentiment. Just a judge, 2 witnesses, Mr. Thornton and Henry's personal attorney, and a signature that bound her to a man who barely spoke to her outside of necessary pleasantries. The ceremony lasted exactly 17 minutes. Margaret had counted each one. Now as Mrs. Caldwell she existed in a strange limbo, neither servant nor partner, neither ignored nor truly seen. The house operated on invisible schedules she was still learning to decode. Breakfast appeared in the dining room at precisely 7 o'clock each morning, whether anyone was there to eat it or not. The staff moved through the halls like ghosts, appearing when needed and vanishing the moment their tasks were complete. Everything ran with mechanical precision, orchestrated by Mrs. Monroe, the head housekeeper, a stern woman of 50 with iron-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. Henry left before dawn each morning, his footsteps a distant rhythm in the hallway outside Margaret's bedroom. She would lie awake listening to him descend the stairs, the front door closing with a decisive click that marked the beginning of her solitary day. He returned late in the evening, going directly to his study where he worked behind closed doors until well past midnight. She knew this because she could see the lamplight spilling from beneath his door when she walked the halls, unable to sleep. Meals were silent, consumed at opposite ends of a dining table long enough to seat 20 guests. The distance between them felt deliberate, carefully measured. When Henry did speak, it was about logistics, an upcoming dinner with the governor, a charity auction she was expected to attend, the proper form of address for a senator's wife, the names of business associates she needed to remember. Never about her, never about them, never about anything that mattered. Margaret learned quickly that the house had rules, unspoken, but absolute. Do not enter his study uninvited. Do not ask about his work. Do not expect affection. Do not disturb the careful equilibrium Henry had constructed around his life. She spent her days wandering the mansion's endless rooms, discovering spaces that seemed untouched for years. A music room with a piano covered in dust, a conservatory full of plants that someone tended but no one enjoyed, a portrait gallery lined with stern-faced Caldwells, all of them looking vaguely disappointed, as if they'd expected more from their descendants. The library became her sanctuary. It occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with leather-bound volumes, first editions, collections in French and German and Latin. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by windows that overlooked the gardens. Margaret spent hours there reading everything she could find: philosophy, history, poetry she'd never been allowed to read as a girl, books on commerce and industry that explained in dry technical language exactly how Henry Caldwell had built his empire. She learned about oil speculation, about the strategic acquisition of smaller companies, about the railroad contracts that had made him untouchable. She read about the Ravenport refinery fire of 1879, which had killed 12 men and bankrupted Henry's only serious competitor. The official inquiry had cleared Caldwell Oil of any responsibility, but the questions lingered in the margins of old newspaper clippings Margaret found tucked between the pages of an accounting ledger. She wondered if Henry knew she was reading these things, if he cared, if he ever thought about those 12 men. One evening, 3 weeks into the marriage, something shifted. Margaret had been sitting in the library as twilight descended, a book forgotten in her lap. She'd been staring out the window, watching the gaslit streets of Ravenport flicker to life below, when Henry appeared in the doorway. She startled, her hand flying to her chest. He rarely came to this part of the house. "I apologize," he said, his voice formal and stiff. "I didn't realize you were here." "It's your house," Margaret replied, carefully marking her place in the book and setting it aside. "You don't need to apologize for being in it." He hesitated, his hand still resting on the doorframe. For a moment she thought he might leave, retreat back into the familiar patterns of avoidance they'd established. Instead, he stepped inside, his movements controlled and deliberate as always. Henry crossed to the window, standing with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. The failing light cast his profile in shadow. Margaret studied him silently, the rigid set of his shoulders, the precise part in his dark hair, the way he stood as if bracing against an invisible weight. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, growing heavier with each passing second. "You've been comfortable?" he asked finally, still not looking at her. "Mrs. Munro mentioned you've been spending time in the library." "Yes. Thank you. It's a remarkable collection. It was my father's. He believed in education, even if he didn't believe in much else." It was the first personal thing Henry had said to her since the wedding. Margaret felt something shift in the air between them, fragile as spider silk. "You've read the commercial journals," he continued, and it wasn't a question. Margaret's breath caught. So he did know. "I was curious about your work. Most women would find it tedious. Most women aren't married to the Oil King of Pennsylvania." Henry turned then, his dark eyes finding hers across the dimly lit room. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of amusement. "Is that what they call me?" "Among other things, I can imagine." He moved away from the window, closer to where she sat, though he maintained a careful distance. "What did you think of the journals, the ledgers, the history of Caldwell Oil?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "I think you've built something extraordinary. I think you're brilliant at what you do, and I think it's cost you more than money." Henry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's a rather bold observation from someone who's known me less than a month. You asked what I thought, so I did." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. Margaret felt exposed under that scrutiny, as if he were reading her the way he read his contracts and correspondence, searching for weaknesses, hidden clauses, unspoken terms. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect? Someone more pliable. Someone who would be content with the house, the clothes, the position, and not ask questions. Would you prefer that?" "I'm not certain." Henry's voice was soft, almost thoughtful. "It would certainly be simpler." "I can be simpler, if that's what you require," Margaret offered, though the words tasted bitter. "I can be whatever you need me to be, Mr. Caldwell. That was our arrangement, wasn't it?" Something dark passed over Henry's features. Don't reduce yourself like that. Isn't that exactly what this marriage is? A reduction? Of both of us?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and true. Henry turned away, his control reasserting itself like armor sliding back into place. "I should let you return to your reading. I have work that requires my attention." "Of course." Margaret kept her voice neutral, empty of the disappointment that threatened to surface. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell." He paused at the doorway, his back to her. "Henry, I'm sorry. You may call me Henry. When we're alone, it seems appropriate, given the circumstances." "Then good night, Henry." He didn't respond, didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders rise and fall with a breath that might have been relief, or resignation, or something else entirely. And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, fading into the vast silence of the house. Margaret sat alone in the darkening library, the ghost of his presence still hanging in the air like smoke. Outside, the city lights bloomed brighter as night fell completely. Somewhere in the mansion a clock chimed the hour. 9 bells, each one marking time in a house where time seemed to move differently, slower and faster all at once. She picked up her book but couldn't focus on the words. Her mind kept returning to the conversation, to the unexpected vulnerability she'd glimpsed beneath Henry's carefully maintained exterior. "You're not what I expected." The words echoed in her thoughts. For the first time since the wedding, Margaret wondered if Henry Caldwell was lonely too. If beneath all that control and calculation, there was a man who'd forgotten how to be anything other than the Oil King. A man who'd built an empire and found himself ruling it alone. She looked down at the emerald ring on her finger, its green depths catching the last light from the window. 1 year, she reminded herself. Just 1 year, and then freedom. But freedom from what, exactly? From this house, from this marriage, or from the strange, unwanted curiosity that was beginning to take root in her chest whenever Henry was near. Margaret closed her book with a soft thud and stood, moving to the window. Ravenport stretched out below, a tapestry of light and shadow, of commerce and corruption, of dreams built on the backs of men who died in refinery fires while the Oil King's empire grew. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling the barrier between her and the world outside. Tomorrow she would attend her first official function as Mrs. Caldwell, a dinner at the governor's mansion. Henry had left detailed instructions with Mrs. Monroe about which gown to wear, which jewelry, how to arrange her hair. Every detail orchestrated, every moment choreographed. She would smile, she would charm, she would play her role perfectly, because that was the arrangement. That was what survival required. The next morning, Margaret found a small package on the breakfast table beside her plate. Her heart quickened as she reached for it, the brown paper crinkling under her fingers. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting, the leather soft and well-made. The craftsmanship was exquisite. This wasn't something ordered hastily from a shop. Someone had taken time to select it. No note accompanied it, no explanation, just the journal, placed carefully beside her morning tea. Margaret ran her fingers over the smooth cover, feeling the quality of the leather, the weight of all those empty pages. She opened it, breathing in the scent of new paper and possibility. On the inside cover, in Henry's precise handwriting, were 4 words: "For your thoughts. H." Margaret closed the journal carefully, holding it against her chest as something dangerous and unwanted bloomed inside her. Hope. Such a foolish, fragile thing. But there it was, taking root, despite every logical reason to tear it out. She looked toward the head of the table where Henry sat behind his newspaper, his face hidden, his coffee growing cold in its cup. He gave no indication that he'd left the gift, no acknowledgement that anything had changed, but something had. In the space between silence and speech, between distance and proximity, between the Oil King and the woman who wore his ring, something had shifted. Margaret picked up her teacup with steady hands and took a sip. Outside the tall windows, morning light spilled across the gardens of Sycamore Hill, gilding everything it touched. And in the quiet house, two people sat at opposite ends of a table, bound by contract and separated by choice, while the space between them grew incrementally smaller, one careful inch at a time. Chapter 3. The Letter That Changed Everything. Margaret had always known her father's debts were substantial. What she hadn't known was that they were tied to Henry Caldwell. The letter arrived on a cold October morning, 6 weeks into the marriage. It was delivered by courier, addressed specifically to Mrs. Margaret Caldwell in formal script. She recognized the letterhead immediately. Crawford and Associates, a law firm in Philadelphia she'd never heard of before. She opened it in the library, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the wax seal. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Outside, the gardens were preparing for winter, the last autumn leaves clinging desperately to bare branches. Margaret unfolded the thick paper and began to read. Dear Mrs. Caldwell, we are writing to inform you that the final settlement of your late father's estate has been completed, as per the terms agreed upon between Mr. Jonathan Ashbury and Mr. Henry Caldwell on March 12, 1887. All outstanding debts totaling $47,000 have been transferred to Caldwell Oil and subsequently forgiven in exchange for the marriage contract executed on September 14, 1887. All legal obligations have been fulfilled. No further action is required. Respectfully, William Crawford, Senior Partner. Margaret's vision blurred. She read the words again and again. The paper slipped from her fingers and drifted to the floor like a fallen leaf. $47,000, March 12th, 3 months before her father's death. The marriage contract. Henry hadn't married her out of convenience or even cold practicality. He had married her because he owned her father's debts. The arrangement hadn't been a generous offer to help a desperate woman. It had been a transaction, a calculated acquisition to absorb her family's financial ruin and fold it neatly into his expanding empire. She wasn't a wife. She was collateral. Margaret stood abruptly, the leather chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The library suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing inward, the thousands of books watching her like silent witnesses to her humiliation. She pressed her hands against the windowsill, staring out at the manicured perfection of the grounds. Everything in Henry Caldwell's world was controlled, ordered, possessed. The gardens, the house, the servants, the city below, and now her. He had bought her, just as he bought everything else. Refineries, railroad contracts, politicians, silence. He had seen a problem, calculated the most efficient solution, and executed it with the same cold precision he brought to every business deal. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. How long had he known? When he'd stood in that drawing room 6 months ago, offering her the emerald ring with such businesslike detachment, had he already owned her father's debts then? Had he been collecting on an investment he'd made months earlier? She thought of all the small gestures over the past weeks, the journal he'd left at breakfast, the few evenings when he'd lingered in doorways, almost speaking, almost human, the way he'd told her to call him Henry when they were alone. Had any of it been real, or was it all just careful management of an asset he'd acquired? The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times, each bell a hammer blow to her chest. Margaret turned from the window and retrieved the letter from the floor. She folded it carefully, precisely, her movements controlled even as fury burned beneath her skin. She tucked it into the pocket of her morning dress, feeling its weight against her hip like evidence in a trial. She would confront him tonight. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Margaret moved through the day like an actress playing a role she'd already memorized. She took lunch in the conservatory. She wrote a cheerful letter to her mother, carefully editing out every true thought. She selected a book from the library and didn't read a single word. At 6 o'clock, she dressed for dinner in a gown of deep burgundy, her hair arranged simply at the nape of her neck. She clasped a strand of pearls around her throat, a gift from Henry on their wedding day, beautiful and cold. She descended the stairs at precisely 7 o'clock, as she had every evening for 6 weeks. Henry was already seated at the head of the dining table, reviewing a contract while he waited. He looked up when she entered, and something flickered across his face. Appreciation, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that she'd fulfilled her part of their unspoken agreement to maintain appearances. Margaret. He stood as he always did, a gesture of courtesy that now felt like mockery. You look well, thank you. Her voice was steady, betraying nothing. They sat. The first course appeared, consommé in delicate china bowls. Margaret lifted her spoon mechanically, tasting nothing. Henry had returned to his contract, reading while he ate with the efficiency of a man who viewed meals as necessary fuel rather than pleasure. "I received a letter today," Margaret said quietly. Henry's eyes remained on the document. "Oh, from your mother? From Crawford and Associates in Philadelphia." His hand stilled, the spoon halfway to his mouth. Very slowly, very carefully, he set it down and looked at her. The mask was perfect, his expression revealing nothing. But Margaret had learned to read the small signs, the slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, the measured breath before he spoke. "I see." "Do you?" Margaret set down her own spoon with deliberate precision. "Do you see, Henry? Because I'm only beginning to understand myself." Margaret, $47,000. March 12th, 3 months before my father died. Each fact landed like a stone dropped into still water. You owned his debts. You owned him. And when he was gone, you decided to collect by owning me instead. Henry's jaw tightened. "That's not how it was." "Then tell me how it was." She kept her voice low, controlled, though everything inside her screamed. "Tell me the truth. For once, just tell me the truth." He was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he stood, moving to the sideboard where crystal decanters caught the lamplight. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, drank half of it in one swallow. "Your father came to me in March," he said finally, his back to her. "His investments had failed. The creditors were circling. He was desperate. So you helped him. I gave him a loan. Generous terms, more generous than any bank would have offered. And in exchange," Henry turned to face her, the glass still in his hand, "he offered me what he had left. His daughter's hand in marriage to secure his family's future." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "My father sold me. He protected you in the only way he knew how, by making me property, by ensuring that even after his death I'd be owned by someone, by ensuring you'd be safe." Henry's control cracked, his voice rising for the first time since she'd known him. "Do you know what would have happened otherwise? The creditors would have taken everything. Your mother would have been destitute. You would have had no prospects, no future, nothing. So you decided to save me. How noble." "I decided to honor an agreement made by a desperate father who loved his daughter enough to sacrifice his pride." Margaret stood, her chair scraping back. "You should have told me." "When? When you were standing in that drawing room with nowhere else to turn. When you were mourning your father and watching your world collapse." Henry set down his glass with enough force that it cracked. "I gave you a choice, Margaret. You could have said no. You knew I couldn't. You knew exactly how desperate I was. That's why you waited. That's why you made it seem like generosity instead of collection on a debt." The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Henry's expression shifted, hardened. "What do you want me to say? That I manipulated the situation, that I took advantage? Perhaps I did. But I also kept my word. I've treated you with respect. I've asked nothing of you beyond what we agreed. You asked for my life. I gave you security in exchange." "Security?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I'm a prisoner in a beautiful house, married to a man who sees me as an acquisition. That's not security, Henry. That's a different kind of cage." She moved toward the door, needing distance, needing air. "Where are you going?" Margaret paused at the threshold, her hand on the frame. She looked back at him, this man who had seemed so controlled, so untouchable, now standing in the lamplight with something almost like pain in his eyes. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I can't be here right now. I can't sit across from you and pretend this doesn't change everything. Margaret, please, did you ever intend to let me go?" After the year, Henry was silent. That silence was answer enough. Margaret walked out of the dining room, through the marble hallway, up the grand staircase. She didn't run. She maintained her dignity, her composure, every inch the proper Mrs. Caldwell, even as everything inside her shattered. She reached her bedroom and closed the door quietly behind her. Only then did she let herself break. 3 months passed like a slow-burning fuse. Margaret continued to play her role with flawless precision. She attended dinners with senators and their wives. She smiled at charity auctions. She wore expensive gowns and made polite conversation about nothing that mattered. To the outside world, Mrs. Henry Caldwell was everything a society wife should be. Poised, elegant, perfectly controlled. But behind the closed doors of Sycamore Hill, she had become a ghost haunting her own life. She and Henry maintained a careful distance, speaking only when necessary, their conversations reduced to logistics and schedules. The brief moments of connection they'd shared before the letter arrived seemed like something she'd imagined, fragile and impossible, gone before they'd ever truly existed. Margaret spent her days in the library, but she was no longer reading about oil refineries and railroad contracts. She was reading law, property law, marriage law, contract law. She studied with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign, taking notes in the journal Henry had given her, filling page after page with careful observations. She learned about the legal structures that protected men like Henry Caldwell, the ways wealth could be shielded, hidden, moved through corporate entities that existed only on paper. She learned about the politicians he'd funded, the judges who owed him favors, the complex web of obligations that kept Ravenport's elite bound together in mutual self-interest. But she also learned about the cracks in that foundation, the contracts signed under questionable circumstances, the rival companies that had failed under mysterious conditions, the workers who died in accidents that were never properly investigated, the testimonies that had disappeared before they could reach courtrooms. Henry Caldwell's empire wasn't just built on oil and ambition, it was built on silence, the silence of people who were too afraid or too well compensated to speak the truth. And Margaret realized something that should have terrified her, but instead filled her with cold, clarifying purpose. She could break that silence. The Ravenport Oil Company's annual stockholders' dinner was held on the first Saturday of December at the Grand Pacific Hotel. It was the social event of the season. 200 of the city's most powerful men and their wives gathered to celebrate another year of unprecedented profits. Margaret dressed with particular care that evening. She chose a gown of silver-grey silk that caught the light like smoke, elegant but not ostentatious. She arranged her hair simply, letting it fall in soft waves rather than the elaborate styles most women favored. She wore the pearl necklace Henry had given her, but she left the emerald ring on her dressing table. Her left hand was bare when she descended the stairs at 7 o'clock. Henry was waiting in the entrance hall, immaculate in his evening clothes. His eyes went immediately to her hand, and his expression shifted. Not anger exactly, but something harder to name. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. Margaret. His voice was carefully neutral. Henry. She met his gaze steadily. Shall we go? I wouldn't want to be late. They rode to the hotel in silence, the carriage wheels clattering over cobblestones, the city passing by in a blur of gaslight and shadow. Henry stared out the window, his jaw tight, his hands clasped in his lap. Margaret felt strangely calm. After 3 months of careful preparation, she knew exactly what she was going to do. The outcome was uncertain, but the choice itself felt like the first true choice she'd made since her father's death. The ballroom glittered with crystal and candlelight. Champagne flowed freely. Men clustered in groups, discussing profit margins and expansion plans, while their wives compared jewelry and exchanged carefully edited versions of their lives. Margaret moved through the crowd with quiet grace, speaking to everyone and saying nothing of substance. She could feel eyes following her, noting the absence of the ring, whispers spreading like ripples across water. Henry remained across the room, surrounded by business associates, but she felt his awareness of her like a physical weight. At precisely 9 o'clock, Margaret excused herself from a conversation about the latest fashions from Paris and made her way to the terrace. The December air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of coal smoke and distant rain. The city spread out below the hotel, a tapestry of light and darkness, of wealth and poverty existing side by side in careful ignorance of each other. She wasn't surprised when Henry followed her outside minutes later. He closed the terrace doors behind him, muffling the sounds of celebration. They stood alone under a sky heavy with clouds, the threat of snow in the air. "You took off the ring," he said quietly. Margaret turned to face him, her hands steady. "I'm returning it, along with your name and everything that comes with it." Henry's face was unreadable in the shadows. "The contract? I've filed for annulment. The papers were delivered to your attorney this afternoon." She reached into her small evening bag and withdrew an envelope, holding it out to him. "These are copies, letters from workers who witnessed safety violations at your refineries, testimonies from families of men who died in accidents you chose not to investigate, documentation of contracts you signed under false pretenses, evidence of bribes paid to city inspectors and judges." Henry stared at the envelope as if it might contain poison. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter? They're real. They're documented. And tomorrow morning they'll be published in the Ravenport Gazette, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the New York Times." His hand shot out, gripping her wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop her from moving. "You'll destroy me. You destroyed yourself." Margaret's voice was quiet but unwavering. "You built an empire on the backs of desperate people. You manipulated, you controlled, you bought silence and called it progress. Someone needed to speak the truth, and it had to be you, my wife? I was never your wife, Henry. I was a debt you collected, a problem you solved, an asset you acquired. She pulled her wrist free gently, but firmly. But I'm also the only person who got close enough to see what you really built, and I won't be silent about it. Henry stepped back, as if she'd struck him. For a long moment he said nothing, just stood there in the cold December air, the sounds of celebration muted behind the glass doors. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. I never meant to hurt you, I know. And she did. She could see it in his eyes. Genuine confusion that his carefully calculated decisions had caused real pain. But intention doesn't erase consequence. Those 12 men who died in the refinery fire? I'm sure you never intended for that to happen either, but it did, and you covered it up to protect your interests. I was protecting jobs, livelihoods. The entire industry in this region depends on lies? Margaret finished. On buying silence? On treating human lives as acceptable losses in your pursuit of profit? Henry turned away, gripping the terrace railing. His shoulders were rigid with tension. What do you want from me, Margaret? An apology? Repentance? What would be enough? I don't want anything from you, that's the point. I'm not asking for your permission or your understanding. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Tomorrow the truth comes out. Your empire will face scrutiny, investigations, consequences. She paused. You'll survive it. Men like you always do. But it won't be the same. And neither will I. She moved toward the terrace doors, but Henry's voice stopped her. Why now? You've had this information for months. Why wait until tonight? Margaret looked back at him one final time. In the dim light, he looked smaller somehow, less imposing than the Oil King who'd offered her a ring and called it an arrangement. Because I needed to be sure that this wasn't about anger or revenge, that it was about doing what's right regardless of the cost. She smiled sadly. For you taught me that, actually. About making difficult choices and living with the consequences. You just didn't expect me to apply those lessons to you. She opened the terrace doors, and warm air rushed out to meet the cold. Behind her, Henry remained frozen at the railing, silhouetted against the city lights. Goodbye, Henry, Margaret said softly. I hope someday you'll understand why this had to happen. She didn't wait for his response. Margaret left the hotel through a side entrance, avoiding the crowds. A carriage she'd hired independently waited on the street. She gave the driver an address in the modest neighborhood where she'd grown up, a small apartment she'd rented using the settlement money Henry had quietly transferred to her account weeks ago, before he'd known what she planned to do. As the carriage pulled away from the Grand Pacific Hotel, Margaret looked down at her bare left hand. The skin was pale where the ring had been, a ghost of the weight she'd carried for 3 months. Tomorrow the newspapers would run the story. Henry Caldwell's empire wouldn't collapse overnight, but it would crack. Investigations would begin. Questions would be asked. The silence he'd purchased so carefully would finally break. And Margaret Ashbury, no longer Caldwell, would face an uncertain future with nothing but her integrity and the truth she'd chosen to tell. It was enough. The carriage turned a corner, and the lights of the hotel disappeared behind her. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, a new life waited. One she would build herself, on her own terms, without contracts or conditions or cages disguised as security. Snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering Ravenport in white. Margaret closed her eyes and felt for the first time in months like she could finally breathe. Some empires fall in fire and fury, others fall in quiet truth, but they all fall eventually. And when they do, the people who were brave enough to speak, they're the ones who remain standing.